My girlfriend had just summoned something terrible. She had found the Necronomicon, also known as the Book of the Dead. There was a kind of silence that you could only feel in places where no human foot had ever set foot. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was something heavier pressing down on you like the air was changing. I felt it the moment we got out of the car. The trees around us were completely still. No breeze, no birds, just silence. It was thick, like a spider's web that wrapped around you, making you feel completely small and helpless. Everything seemed frozen, frozen in time, and there was no sign of any living life. Are you sure? I asked, glancing at Megan. She was already pulling her backpack out of the trunk, moving faster than usual. There was an inexplicable determination in her eyes, something dark and deep that I couldn't quite place. She was different, on the verge of madness, and it scared me. Megan had always been obsessed with her hobbies, but today she was so stubborn that it was starting to feel like more than just another whim. It wasn't just a desire to unwind or relieve stress. She seemed to be yearning for something, and it was something in the air. "Of course," she said, not looking at me, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "You promised." I didn't seem to have promised anything specific, but Megan had an uncanny way of turning any half of a deal into a full promise. When she first mentioned this trip, I thought it was just another weird whim of hers, like her love of tarot and mystical theories and other absurd things. I went with her because it was her, and that was enough. But this was something different. This was no longer just a weekend in the woods. This was a journey into the depths of something dark and unknown, and I felt as if I were plunging into something from which there was no escape. The cabin looked even more abandoned than I had expected. The wood on the walls was cracked, the windows boarded up, but there was something strange about the way it had been preserved, as if the earth itself had embraced it. It looked like part of the landscape, not a remnant of human activity. Everything around it seemed hidden from time. If I hadn't known that this place had been abandoned long ago, I might have thought that people lived here, but this was a different silence, an ominous, soulless one. When Megan opened the door, it creaked as if it were a breach in that silence, and I felt something heavy and invisible approaching. It was something that could not be seen, but could be felt. The entire forest and land around this cabin seemed to be coming alive, but not in a good way. "After you," she said, stepping aside with a smile that showed neither joy nor warmth, only a cold determination. She was obsessed with something, and I couldn't figure out what. I entered, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. There was no furniture, just a stone fireplace and a thick layer of dust that almost made it hard to breathe. I couldn't help but laugh, feeling like I was in a place where criminals might leave their victims. Everything around me looked as if no one had been here for decades. A heavy atmosphere, an unreal sense of lifelessness. I could feel my footsteps echoing around the room, each one too loud for the deathly silence. Megan ignored my words, just finished setting up the candles, and I noticed that her movements were precise and deliberate. She was placing them around her, as if she were making room for something. Something terrible. It somehow looked as if she knew what was going to happen and was preparing for it with cold determination. I could feel fear building inside me. The more I watched, the more I felt like I was witnessing something that couldn't be changed, something that couldn't be stopped. "What kind of circus is this?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but the fear was seeping into my voice. She didn't answer. She just finished setting them up, and I noticed that her face was lit up red from the flames. The candles cast disturbing shadows, and strange, distorted shapes began to appear on the walls, moving with a life of their own. "This is perfect, right?" she asked, with a quiet fascination that frightened me. It sounded like the words of something other than a human being, something that had something to do with the darkness. "Yes, if you like places where serial killers bury bodies." I replied, trying to be funny, but she ignored me. "You don't understand," she said, and paused for a few long seconds before speaking again. "You'll see later." And I could feel her every word echoing in my soul, like a sentence. She took an old book from her backpack, the leather cover cracked, and the pages so fragile they could just be scattered in the wind. The book looked like something very old, like something that was destined to be forgotten, and I couldn't understand why she was holding it in her hands, why she had brought it here. "What is this?" I asked, swallowing, feeling my fear grow stronger. "Open it," she said quietly but stubbornly, a shadow on her face that wasn't always there. The tunnel opened into a vast, suffocating chamber. My stomach churned. The walls were lined with cages, rusted metal bars twisted into unnatural, organic shapes. Inside each cage was something wrong. Some creatures were humanoid, like the twisted beings in the tunnel, while others were monstrous, beyond anything my mind could fathom. Every nightmare I had ever imagined seemed to be trapped down here, their eyes glistening with hunger, their bodies contorted in grotesque ways. Megan stepped toward one of the cages, her breath quickening. "They've been waiting for us," she whispered, her voice trembling with a dark excitement. I grabbed her by the shoulders, spinning her to face me. "Megan, this is insane. We need to get out of here now." But she just laughed. It was a sound devoid of any warmth, like a hollow echo. "This is what I wanted. Can't you see? We've tapped into something bigger than us, something unstoppable." I could feel the shift in her. She was no longer just curious, she was consumed. And as I turned to look back at the cages, the creatures began to thrash violently, their twisted limbs slamming against the bars. I didn't wait to see if the cages would hold. I grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her toward the tunnel, but just as I spoke, a low, guttural laugh echoed from one of the cages. The creature inside slammed its head against the metal, and the cage began to bend. The bars groaned, and with a sickening crack, they broke open. The creature, a massive abomination, stepped out, towering, blocking our way. For the first time, I saw fear in Megan's eyes. We ran, our breaths ragged, down the maze of tunnels, the walls pressing in tighter as we went. The creature's heavy footsteps echoed behind us, growing louder with each turn. We had no idea where we were headed. Every tunnel looked the same, an endless nightmare. I glanced at Megan. Despite everything, despite the terror that gripped me, she was smiling. Her breath was shallow, but there was a dangerous gleam in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before. She was feeding off this madness, craving the danger. Suddenly, we turned a corner and nearly collided with another creature. This one even bigger, its skin slick and wet, its arms grotesquely long. It reached for us, its fingers like claws, and Megan was about to speak when I yanked her to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. We scrambled into another tunnel, this one sloping downward, deeper into the hellish labyrinth. The air became thick, suffocating. "Where are we going?" Megan gasped. "I don't know," I muttered. "Away from whatever those things are." The tunnel seemed endless, each passage twisting into the next, but none felt like an escape. We were trapped, lost in this nightmare. "How much further can this go?" I asked, my voice breaking. Megan didn't answer. She was too busy staring at the creatures that lingered in the shadows, her eyes wide with fascination. And then, in the distance, something caught my eye, a glimmer of metal. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice strained. Megan squinted, recognition flickering in her eyes. "It's an elevator." I didn't know how she knew, but I didn't care. We had to reach it. I dragged her toward it as the creatures closed in behind us, their guttural growls echoing through the tunnels. We reached the small chamber where the elevator stood, rusted and ancient. The door was grated, the mechanism old and creaking. I yanked it open, the metal screeching in protest. "Get in," I hissed. "This has to lead back up." I shoved her inside, slamming the door just as one of the creatures lunged at us from the tunnel. I turned the crank as fast as I could, my arms burning, the metal creaking and groaning as the elevator slowly ascended. Below us, the creatures gathered, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. I could hear their twisted faces pressing against the metal, their breaths ragged as they watched us rise. Megan was still smiling, her eyes fixed on the creatures below, almost disappointed as they faded from view. "I can't believe we found this," she whispered. "We've seen them. We've really seen them." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The thought of what we had just escaped, of what Megan had become, was too much. I just kept cranking the elevator, praying it would take us far away from this nightmare. The walls of the shaft closed in, the elevator creaking and groaning the further we ascended. But even as we moved higher, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us at the top. The elevator shuddered again, jolting, as if it, too, were alive, fighting against the inevitable. When the elevator finally reached the top, I shoved the grated door open. The air felt wrong. The cabin was darker, suffocating, as if the very structure of the place had changed. Megan stepped out first, still clutching that damn candle, her steps slow, reluctant. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the door, desperate to leave. But as we reached the porch, I took a step forward and hit something solid. It was as if I had slammed into an invisible wall, the force knocking me back. I tried again, pushing harder this time, but the barrier refused to yield. I couldn't leave. Megan reached out, her brow furrowing in confusion. She touched the same invisible barrier. "It's real," she whispered. Before I could say a word, a voice filled the air, deep, hollow, resonating through the ground itself. "You can't leave." "Because." Slowly, I turned around. Standing in the doorway of the cabin was a figure, tall and skeletal, its bones sickly yellow as if they had been rotting for centuries. Its eye sockets glowed with an unnatural light. "You've opened the passage," it rasped. "The Necronomicon has called forth the gates of hell." Megan stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What do you mean?" she asked. The skeletal figure tilted its head, amused. "Their ritual has bound this cabin to hell, sweetheart. It no longer belongs to your world. And so one of you must stay. Forever." The word struck me like a death sentence. My mind spun, trying to process what it was saying. And then Megan turned to me, her face full of sweetness, a sickly smile stretching across her lips. "Oh, honey," she cooed. "You understand, don't you? I know you'll do the right thing. You always do." Her hand rested on my arm, her eyes glistening with twisted affection. "I won't forget your sacrifice." Sacrifice. She expected me to stay here, trapped in hell so she could go free. My mind snapped. The realization hit me like a hammer. She had orchestrated all of this. She was insane, and she thought I'd just let her go. I didn't hesitate. I kicked her hard. The force sent her sprawling into the doorway of the cabin, where the skeletal figure reached down, its bony hands gripping her shoulders. Megan's eyes widened with terror as she was dragged back into the cabin. "Help me!" she screamed, but the air seemed to ripple, and the walls of the cabin began to twist and warp, collapsing inward as if the entire structure was being sucked into hell itself. The floor cracked open, fiery red light pouring from below. Megan's last scream echoed through the night as the cabin, and everything inside it, was swallowed whole. Silence. I stood there on the porch, staring at the empty space. Megan was gone, swallowed by the hellish void. All that remained was the Necronomicon, lying in the dirt where she had dropped it. I picked it up, the leather warm in my hands, pulsing with dark energy. I walked slowly to the shed, my hands trembling. I found a shovel and began to dig, the earth soft beneath me, the hole deep enough. I buried the book, watching as the dirt filled the space. When it was done, I wiped the sweat from my brow. I knew there was another cabin nearby, a place forgotten by most. I told myself no one would find the book here. But deep down, I knew better. I hadn't stopped it. I'd only delayed it. I left the woods that night. I didn't go back to my apartment. I didn't go back to the life I once knew. I couldn't. I packed a bag, got in my car, and just drove. No destination. Just away. The nightmare started a week later. Visions of Megan being dragged down into the earth, her face twisted in terror, her screams echoing in my mind. And then came the rumors, strange disappearances, creatures in the woods, whispers of the cabin. I knew it was happening again. The Necronomicon had been found, but I couldn't stop it, and neither could anyone else.